first, just to look at CIC a little bit as they say here, at a glance. One thing to keep in mind when we talk about migration, there is a kind of an essential tension, traditional historical tension. It has always been there, and it's still with us. It's not a kind of earth-shaking tension, but it's important to realize it. CIC, in terms of its mandate, tries to facilitate the flow of immigrants to Canada, but at the same time, it needs to control that flow. So it's not a facilitation in the sense of going out and promoting and doors are open, anybody wants to come in. It's not that type of facilitation. It's a kind of a balanced one where the facilitation role is balanced with the control, the screening, right? So you're screening for, you don't want the criminals or really bad guys or people with disease or certain type of conditions that would put Canadian health and security at risk. So those are important considerations because they come into the equation at any type of decision-making level. Or policy development level. So this is something to really keep in mind. CIC, in terms of its overall mandate, very recently, not that it matters that much, but it's important for you to know, has also received the passport services, which used to be with Foreign Affairs, now it's with CIC. Also, again, very recently from Foreign Affairs, we also have taken over the program, this morning we talked about it this afternoon, the International Exchange Canada, the IEC program, that also came to CIC, just to keep in mind. But having those, now we have a spectrum of programs ranging from making immigration decisions to integration, refugee settlement. We will look at those a little more in detail in a few minutes. And overall, it's a very large department. It's not the largest in the federal public service, but about 5,000 employees. That's a big organization. Even if you look at some international organizations, not many of them are at that scale. And also another maybe thing to keep in mind is that within CIC, and sometimes even in my presentation, I might start talking about policy, operations, and that kind of stuff. Just keep in mind that the organization itself, two core sectors. One is policy, where basically my colleagues, together with research and evaluation, develop policy, meaning design programs. And then there's an operations sector, which is much larger. That's where the programs get implemented. By that, it could include settlement programming, it could include multiculturalism programming, or it could include basically processing of visas for immigrants or temporary residents. So when you look at, in a sense, if you were to ask the question, well, what does CIC do? At a high level, as I mentioned, CIC screens and approves admissions, either as a permanent resident applications or temporary resident applications. Temporary resident applications can include people who come here as tourists, and also can include people who come here with wanting to have a work permit to work under the temporary foreign worker. But keep in mind those two separations, because it will become clear to you in a few minutes as we discuss different programs, temporary and permanent. And in terms of type of work, CIC does, obviously many of you know, I know especially from the settlement community, there is a huge settlement work that CIC facilitates through funding in terms of helping the settlement of the newcomers. There's a resettlement, which is kind of a play on the words, but basically it deals with the refugees coming to Canada, government-assisted refugees, and facilitates their settlement. The word resettlement basically refers them as coming here to be resettled in Canada as their new home, if you will. And also we, as I mentioned, we do manage access by screening for security and health. And another thing not to forget and not to mix in terms of CIC's mandate, there is a settlement factor, but we also talk oftentimes about integration. And that's where this morning there was a question, integration meaning long-term. It's not the settlement, finding the house, finding the job, but becoming Canadian. That's when we start talking about integration, long-term integration, second generation, the well-being and the success of second generation, and of course citizenship. So CIC also, in terms of its mandate, you will see in a few minutes. In fact, this is the best picture I can show you. Very hard to read, but don't worry about it. I will try to give you a kind of high-level description of it. Later on, when I have a kind of a version of this deck that can be distributed, you will have most of this material. Obviously, I don't see any, no need to take notes. I promise I will get you a version that can be distributed. What this picture is referring to is actually, this is what we call in the government lingo, program alignment architecture, PAA. All federal departments have this, not the same one, but the same concept. It's basically the entire spectrum of programs that a department runs, and basically, together with that, also the top 4 categories, SO 1, 2, 3, 4. SO refers to strategic outcome. So basically, if you say CIC spends about $1.5 billion a year. That's a pretty good amount of money. About $500 million of it is to manage its basically operations, and the other $1 billion goes into the settlement programming. Some to Quebec, and about $700 million of it goes towards the outside of Quebec settlement programming. So when you look at those strategic outcomes, really, if you were to be able, or those who can read it, can explain to the other ones in the back, basically, no, I'm just kidding. But the first one is very important. It's the migration of permanent and temporary residents that strengthen Canada's economy. That's the strategic outcome 1. Which basically means that it's all the stuff that we're going to talk about today, the immigration programming, especially economic immigration, they are all under that strategic outcome 1. Basically, all those programs, you can't read obviously names here, but from federal skill program to Canadian experience class to business immigrants, all those little programs, the boxes, they actually ought to, if they function well, contribute towards that strategic outcome, meaning that if they were to function and deliver the results that they are meant to deliver, they should be creating a migration of permanent and temporary residents, strengthening Canada's economy. That's the purpose as they get delivered those programs. And every single program, later on I'll give you a sense of it, we, and I was mentioning this afternoon, we have an obligation to evaluate every single box that you see on this table within a 5-year time period. By policy, we evaluate all of them one way or another. Either we bundle them together or we do an evaluation research and then publish that. Second strategic outcome, very important to keep in mind, is the one, I'll read it for you, but family and humanitarian migration that reunites families, so family reunification, very important part of the mandate, and also at the same time offers protection to the displaced and persecuted. So this is the refugee programming and family reunification. So sponsoring family members who would be brought here by immigrants or by Canadian citizens, they would fall under that second strategic outcome, and very important component. As you can see, I mean, CIC is not just economic immigration. The third one, strategic outcome 3, is this, again this afternoon we mentioned this, newcomers and citizens participate in fostering an integrated society. So the concept here is, and most of the programs that you are familiar with, multiculturalism, settlement program, citizenship, they fall under this strategic outcome. So all together, bundled, if they are delivered well, and if they support each other, they should be leading towards, now you might say, what is the concept integrated society, what does it mean? We can discuss that, for hours and hours, but they should be contributing towards a Canadian society that's integrated, that is at peace, that is multicultural, that respects diversity, and within which those participants, the newcomers especially, have a fair share in terms of their economic or social or cultural integration. So that is the area where CIC invests most of its direct expenses. The last one is about basically the management of international migration and the health and admissibility type of issues, and that's the strategic outcome 4. Why I go at this length, it is important to understand the complexity of the department, the mandate, and within which, in a few minutes when we start looking at kind of digging down and looking at the economic immigration programs, you will have a better understanding of situating what we talk about in the overall mandate. So when we look at the again, as I said, on the left hand, on the left column, if you can, I'm hoping that you can read from the back, or is it too small? I hope, okay. So one element is the temporary residence, as I discussed. It is very important to keep in mind what is the big difference, if you might say, between temporary residence and permanent residence. Temporary residence, as you can see, which includes visitors and of course international students, of which we have some among us here, temporary foreign workers. These are programs that are driven by demand. So CIC or Government of Canada doesn't go out every year and say, we're going to bring in this many number of tourists this year. No, of course there are targets for the industry, but there is no policy setting targets for those programs. As opposed to permanent residents, which basically they have reset levels. Today, one of our colleagues was asking that question, how do we set levels? Levels are set, in a sense, those programs, PR, are managed. How we set it is a different question, different discussion, but it's something very important to keep in mind when you compare those two streams or those two programs. On the right-hand side, nothing really earth-shaking, but that 12 should be actually 1.2, I believe. It's not that, that's why I'm not circulating the deck. This is kind of how the big categories of permanent resident immigration are distributed currently. In 2012 and 2013 is not very much different either. As you can see, the economic portion is the largest, and then we have the family class, refugees, and other refer to some smaller programs. When you look at the PR program, and in a few minutes we're going to look at the economic immigrants closer, but when you look at the PR, permanent residents, always there's a humanitarian refugee group, family group, and the economic group. And when you look at these groups, also another thing to keep in mind, especially when you start either seeing stats here or stats on your own when you're looking at CIC stats, always keep in mind the following, please, is that when somebody says, oh, there was this many economic immigrants, those numbers, unless it is stated otherwise, they always include the principal applicant and the family members. So if CIC, if you see a statistic saying there were 10,000 of such, if it doesn't state that that's only principal applicants, because it is important to keep in mind, because when you talk about economic and labor market impact, the levels that CIC sets, we never know. Of course, we can guess, but when you say there is such a level of federal skilled workers that we want to bring in, that's always a number that includes the whole family. It's not the entire number that comes and starts working in the, taking part in the labor market. No questions so far, so I'm hoping it's making sense, at least a little bit. Now, in terms of economic immigration being a key priority, probably not much need here to spend too much time on it, but it is important to underline, especially in the last, say, 5-6 years, more and more emphasis has been put on migration, but immigration policies playing a greater role in economic development. So as you can see here, there are speeches from Davos to other places. This is always in the newspapers and whatnot, and trying to look at how can immigration play a more active and direct role in the development of Canadian economy overall. This ranges from all the way finding the right immigrants, right skills at the right time, and making sure they are here in Canada and contributing to the economy, but at the same time bringing the right businessmen, right entrepreneurs, so they can come in and they can generate more economic activity. So it's the full spectrum, including the temporary residents, right? Temporary foreign workers. So it's something to keep in mind as we discuss and also look at closer in terms of economic immigration. So here again, really biggest kind of a takeaway from this little slide, and we're going to look at most of those programs in a second, except the Quebec selected skilled workers. The reminder that when you look at the immigration overall, because it's a joint jurisdiction, right, with provinces and federal, you can also cut and slice the immigration economic programs by national versus provincial. It is important because it's a different way of approaching the immigration decisions or policies. So when you look at it in terms of the provincial, territorial, outside of Quebec, one of the key programs that has been on the increase for the last 4 or 5 years, those who follow the statistics will know, it's the provincial nominee program, where the provinces, and we will talk in a few minutes about that, where the provinces, I would call, have the lead in terms of determining who should be coming to Canada. And then, of course, CIC works with them, and at the end, you have a very successful PNP program. I know successful. It was evaluated 2-3 years ago, and the results were looking good, and now, in fact, they are looking even better now. And then the national programs, obviously, but we're gonna come back to that. So when you look at right now, what you're seeing here on this chart is even a closer look at the economic immigration. A little while ago, that was the full package. Now you're looking at the economic immigration and trying to kind of see how that spreads. Of course, in a different world, probably a better world, if I had nice data display kind of skills, you could see a graph changing over time, you can see colors changing and stuff. I don't have those things. So you'll have to be kind of satisfied with this. This is a 2012 snapshot, right? So if you looked at 4 or 5 years ago, the orange would have been much smaller. Obviously, it is where it is now, and it might be increasing even further as we go forward. The CEC, the red one, right here, right? If you can see the cursor, it was non-existent about 4 or 5 years ago. For 2009, there was none there, and it has been growing since then, right? So I'm just giving you those hints just to kind of give you an idea that none of these kind of proportions, if you will, or ratios, they're never static. They change, and they change as a result of policy decisions. And as I say, the more Canada CIC puts the emphasis on economic immigration, or making the immigration to be more effective in terms of as an effective instrument towards economic development, then you start seeing policy decisions having impact on how these programs behave in terms of the space that they occupy. So let's start looking at some of the programs a little closer. So the first one that I'll invite you here to take a look at with me is the temporary foreign workers. Has been in the newspapers this morning. We discussed this afternoon for a while. A few things to keep in mind to understand TFW, Temporary Foreign Workers Program, really well. One, as I was saying, it's designed to be responsive to labor skill shortages. By its design, basically, it works in such a way that a portion of it is driven by employers who cannot find the labor, the skills that they are looking for. Therefore, they turn around and they go to HRSTC, now it's called ESTC, and they apply for a labor market opinion, saying that we haven't found these skills and this type of labor, this quantity, this quality. And if they receive a labor market opinion from HRSTC, ESTC, then they are allowed to go and find that skill, that labor overseas for a temporary period, not for immigration, permanent immigration purposes, and they would bring. And then there is also what we call non-LMO portion of the TFW program, and that relates to a number of different agreements that are set, meaning a NAFTA or international agreements. The one that I was just mentioning a few minutes ago, International Exchange Canada. It's a program, but it's actually driven by international agreements that Canada has signed with different governments. So Canada would sign an agreement with France. We'll say, French, I forgot exactly the age group, but up to 25, I think 30 years old, youth can come and work in Canada. We'll give them work permits. And France will do the same. So Canadian youth in that age bracket can also go and take a work permit and work in France. Those type of agreements will also generate temporary foreign workers. Why? Because under those agreements, you don't need a labor market opinion because there's nobody really to ask you a labor market opinion. Under those agreements, CIC issues temporary work permits to those individuals who come under those programs. So in your mind, when you think of TFW, think of this LMO and non-LMO. And non-LMO portion is about 2/3 of the program, and LMO is the remainder, 1/3 of the total. You are seeing some statistics here. I'm not going to numbers, not to bore you. To keep in mind, again, making sure that it's the labor market needs that are driving the program, the demand. It's a demand-driven program. And another point to keep in mind is that this is one of the programs, and the next one we're going to look at, International Student Program, are two temporary resident programs that are feeders at a growing rate towards the permanent resident program. Meaning that, as I give you the examples and some numbers in a few minutes, you will see that these two streams, if you will, they're not entirely parallel. There are bridges between them, and in a temporary residence, the temporary work permit holders under the temporary foreign workers program or international students do become permanent residents. And in fact, they are encouraged due to policy and program design, which I will give you an example in a few minutes. So when we look at the international student programs, what do we see? This is one of the programs that many of you will be more kind of naturally connected to. You must have a friend or a colleague or somebody who are here as international students. As you know, international students, especially in the last 5-6 years, it has become more and more easy. It has become easier for them to, first of all, get work permits while they are studying. And especially at the end of their graduation, now they qualify for work permits, and that's their kind of a TR world, if you will, as they are TRs. But at the same time, they're also encouraged if they have a desire to become permanent residents, then they use that status to apply under. In a few minutes, we're going to look at it at the next slide, under the Canadian Experience Class to become permanent residents. When we look at, again, in the Canadian Experience Class, you will notice those are the linkages between the international student and the TFW that allows those two streams to feed each other, if you will, especially the TR feeding the PR, of course. A very close look at Canadian Experience Class, and now, if you have realized, we have moved now into the PR domain, from the TR domain, if you will. Canadian Experience Class, maybe I'm going to take just 2 minutes here and do a little bit of a kind of advertisement for my function. You might say, why all these changes? I mean, where are these policy programs? Who comes up with the CEC program? Like, why wasn't there, say, 8 years or 5 years ago, and why is it there now, right? So part of the story, at least one that I believe in, is that as we do the research and look at evidence, and one of the type of research that we constantly do and measurements that we take is what are the determining factors? What is making what are the kind of metrics of success and what creates success? Now, that depends, of course, how you define success, but one of the definitions of success, only one, I grant it, is economic integration in the labor market. Are the people earning an income, the newcomers, at a level commensurate with their experience and degrees and whatnot, and what type of people are able to do that? So one of the determining factors we have been finding is always the Canadian experience. I mean, some experience in Canadian labor market, and in addition to that also, of course, that touches a little bit in an indirect way, credential recognition, and hence a degree from a Canadian post-secondary institution opens a lot of doors, and as we look at retroactively, so we brought all that intelligence into the design of programs, and that's how CEC was born in terms of its origins. So basically what it does is that it puts a couple of requirements in terms of language skills, but it brings in the both streams from students and TFWs, international students and TFWs, and gives them a chance, actually after 1 year of work in Canada, at a level that is, again, appropriate to their background in education, and language requirements being attached to that. For students, this is not an issue usually, because the students haven't gone through the educational system. They have the mastery of one of the official languages. And for the workers, again, there is a CLB for the temporary foreign worker domain. On the NOC-B level, there is a requirement of CLB, Canadian Language Benchmark. This is a kind of a measurement type. If you're asking yourself, what does CLB 5, what is it equivalent to? It'll be probably grade 6, grade 5, roughly, because these things are not one-to-one mapped at all. And CLB 7 that you are seeing for NOC O and A, like administration and high-level management kind of jobs, that's about grade level 11, 10, 11, if you will. No, English.
English skills.
So CLB is the English requirement.
Sorry.
You thought the level is too low? Well, CLB goes only to level 8.
I'm sorry.
No, there's nothing wrong. But maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe you should make your point so we can.
Please finish.
No? Okay, all right. Okay, so basically, the bottom line is there's a language requirement built into the process, and Canadian experience, work experience built into the process. It used to be 2 years for students to be able to eligible for CEC. Now that's reduced to 1 year. So 1 year and a language that qualifies you to apply for under CEC. And as you can see in the numbers below here, so far, I think it's definitely way over the 20,000 individuals. And I don't have the numbers to show and kind of demonstrate to you here, but maybe, who knows, next year or 2 years from now. We have already the initial first year results. By first year, I mean first year income results in terms of our research. And both of these groups, coming from worker or student background, they are doing way above Canadian average. And they are doing way above, obviously, by that definition, also average newcomer immigrant performance. So these are good signs. But again, I keep kind of putting caveats to what I'm saying, but it's important. These are only just economic measures, right? I'm not speaking about social, cultural, other types of integration, but at least on the economic measure, they are doing really well, and there are no reasons why they're not doing well in other domains either, especially on the workers' case. Many of them, temporary foreign workers, spend many years in Canada before they make their application, and in that, we know that they are also establishing community relations, community links, and whatnot. So the next one that we will look at, again, it's a kind of, in a backdoor way, the same story. First of all, the program is the PNP, the Provincial Nominee Program. Again, some of you might be familiar with this. The reason I said it's a kind of a similar story, because this is also another program. As I mentioned, this is the kind of a provincial PT-led program, if you will, that is benefiting from the, if you can look at the bottom numbers, if you can see them, but that is benefiting from the temporary residence stream. So if you look at the all PNP's total average, basically about half of them, provincial nominees, had been temporary residents. Most of them, I don't know really this for a fact, but most of them in the same province. So provinces basically, just to give you a very quick 101 PNP, PNP is different than any other CIC program in the fact that the province identifies the individual. So province identifies the individual and nominates the individual as a first step, which as a step doesn't exist in overall, except in Quebec programs. And then that person identified by the province is processed by CIC, still screened for the same admissibility and health and whatnot, and then arrives as a PNP permanent residence. Sometimes arrives to Canada, sometimes they're already in Canada. As you can see, overall, almost half of them are already in Canada, or they have been here, and they become permanent residents as in some provinces like British Columbia, almost 100% of them have been TRs. So this is the contribution of the temporary resident stream, if you will, either as students or workers, temporary foreign workers, to the development of the permanent resident stream. Around the provincial nominees, to keep in mind again, of course, no program is static. I mean, they're all dynamic and they change over time. One thing to keep in mind around the PNP is that up until the PNP evaluation 2-3 years ago, the PNP program, if you went out and you looked at each province's PNP, you would find very different programs. Programs, in Manitoba would have 15 different streams ranging from family relations, students. They would have, like provinces would have their own student streams to turn a student going to a Manitoba higher education to turn them into PR. Because provinces, the main logic behind the PNP from the very beginning had been the distribution of immigrants. You might have heard the term MTV, not the one, about that MTV, but the MTV, it was the Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver phenomena where most of the immigrants were going and settling in. And the desire was, at least starting from 2006-05 on, trying to do something to really move the immigrants to other centers, if you will. So PNP had made that promise from the very beginning that it would facilitate the distribution of immigrants across Canada, and it has done that, and it is doing that. Meaning, if when you look at, it's not here the statistics, but when you look at the rates of immigrants becoming a PNP, PR in a particular province, let's say, I know Ontario program is very small for now, but we'll see where it goes. But if they become PM, true PMP in Manitoba, most of them stay in Manitoba. There is some movement out of Atlantic, we see that, but when you look to do the mobility analysis, PMP, in a sense, is almost like a glue. Once you receive the PR in that province, they are able to connect and whatnot. The other thing that I want to leave you with as we move forward is the PMP. As I said, there are variations of programs. Now it's kind of slightly, since the evaluation, as you can see, I'm trying to get a credit out of what I do, so it's informing policy. But it is. Since the evaluation, basically, as we found out that there are too many streams and not standardized, and especially we underline the fact that the program wasn't functioning as an economic immigration program. It was more functioning as a family reunification. So families would go to the province and say, you know what, we would like to bring this person. The province would say, okay, sure, and they would come as PRs, but not because of their fit to a labor market need or whatnot. Despite that, their performance has not been very bad, but the program wasn't being responsive specifically, if you will, or primarily to labor market needs. Post-evaluation, and right now we are in the process of, all provinces are participating, moving towards a standardization and making the program more and more economic-driven, still established and led by provinces, but provinces working with the employers and determining those nomination processes, and when you nominate somebody, making sure that that person is a fit to a particular labor market need. So that's the direction that it's moving in. And also there have been some other language requirements also built into the program to ensure that newcomers they have that human capital as they arrive. Actually, that word human capital is a good segue to this. So now let's look at one of the major programs, the Federal Skilled Worker Program. And sometimes you will see federal skilled worker, sometimes you will see skilled worker program. When somebody is talking federal, that means skilled worker program, Quebec left outside of the program. So federal really refers to the program that CIC, or federal government, manages as skilled worker program, as Quebec also does its own. So two things, and you will see it in these two slides, to keep in mind, both in terms of the history of immigration in Canada policies, and also where it is going, I guess. I mentioned the human capital model. I mean, CIC, for the last, say, 15 years or so, has been working with a model that has been named as the human capital model, meaning that if we were to go out and basically identify what it takes to be a successful Canadian permanent resident, later on citizen, meaning education level, language, and whatnot, and then we brought people in, regardless of their background, regardless of their profession, occupation, and whatnot. Those individuals, as they arrive to Canada, they will go around and find the right job, and if that job doesn't work, then they will transfer their skills to another job, and that's the kind of a high-level human capital really approach summary. In the last few years, if you have been watching, especially, let's say, ministerial instructions, different types of policy instruments, as they started kicking in, what started happening is that we started blending that model. In fact, not only blending it, first, evidence-based work has informed and has brought greater integrity to that human capital model, which I will explain to you in a second what I mean. And then we also started blending that model with a more occupation-specific labor market responsiveness. And I will explain that in a second. But just in your mind, please keep that tension. And there is no, as far as I know, even the top economists in Canada, you will hear different kind of voices. Even the ones who are, Arthur Sweetman, Garnet Picot, and top migration economists, they always keep emphasizing human capital, very important. Don't let that go, because that's the one that gives the flexibility and whatnot, and and yet at the same time, many others, the same individuals also, they acknowledge the need to be responsive to market needs. So how did we increase how did CIC, federal government, increase the integrity of the program? If you're able to read again, I'm not sure, but one of the first one is the language abilities. First of all, what you're looking at here, the new point system, it says, this is the grid, but this is really the kind of the test that a federal skilled worker applicant needs to pass to come in, right? The higher, the way we structure this test, if you score higher, your chances of becoming a successful immigrant will be higher. So the first one is the language, and evidence and research has proven this again and again. English, French, official language ability matters a lot. No matter what type of research you do, you slice it this way, or you compare it the other way, you control for the source of origin of country, again, language. So what we did very recently is we started asking for a designated language test. So before, until 2 years ago, I think, people basically would come and say, what is your language level, official language, and the people will basically self-report. Will say high, low, medium. And sometimes if there is time, because visa officers don't interview everybody, 1 out of 10 or 15, I believe, in that conversation, maybe the visa officer might be testing that, if that's true or not. But that was the really level of integrity in terms of checking that criteria and giving a point against. Now, there's an independent third-party certified language test source that this individual, the applicant, goes and gets tested and then submits a score that, if you will, supports their claim of whatever level that they are saying. So that's one level of integrity measure. The second element, again, determinants of success, if you will, is the education. On the education level, very recent kind of, if you will, design revision had been this, and not to confuse with a foreign education credential recognition. It's not that. That's a much more difficult problem to solve. We can discuss it if you have questions on that. But it is the establishing of the equivalency of the degree. So if I say, and I come from Boğaziçi University with a BA or a BA in economics, and if I apply to come to Canada, before I would just basically say that's what I have, they would give me the point for a BA level. Now, if I come with the same claim, CIC says, you know what, you need to go to a third party and get that claim to be validated, if you will, and then come to us saying that your degree is equivalent to a degree in Canada. And out of that basically comes, if somebody says, I'm an engineer, assessment is done, oh no, you're not really an engineer in the Canadian world, you might be a great person with many skills, but you are a technician. If that's the result, that's what comes out, and that's another way that the grid works. Then, of course, we give points for the work experience, and if you might notice, if you are able to read, is the points in this work experience, they have been lowered a little bit. Not that work experience doesn't matter, but this is one area that is very difficult to substantiate. So the room was made in the grid by lowering this, but by increasing language and age. And on the age, more points were given. Again, this is also based on evidence and research to the best of our ability that we undertake, that the younger the entry to Canada, is in terms of readiness for workforce participation, labor market participation, the higher the chances of success. So, and obviously there is the arranged employment and adaptability, a few other points. And adaptability is important because it also gives you a point in terms of your spouse. Remember a minute ago, these are applicants who are being tested. So when a family comes, the applicant, mother or father, doesn't matter who the main applicant is, they make the application and they are assessed. If they pass the test, the whole family arrives. But in the adaptability factor, what we do also, we offer points in terms of the education of the spouse. And then that builds into this, so that kind of a one way of paying attention, if you will, to the total human capital that the family is bringing to Canada. So in this slide, what I'm presenting is the other side of the coin. As I was saying to you, the human capital side. And this is what CIC for the last at least 4 years, I believe, has started doing, especially using the ministerial instructions instrument, to identify, again based on evidence and research, especially in this domain. Actually, we work with HRSTC very closely, ESDC. They have a COPS model. It's a long-term, up to 10 years projection of labor market forecast, looking at occupations, where the gaps are and whatnot. So CIC relies on that. CIC relies on provinces and territories, their input into the process, and on the industry input. Basically, you're going to say, well, what is all this going? All that information comes in, and CIC is trying, again, I'm saying trying, with all modesty here, is to anticipate in what occupational levels, areas, are there or will there be shortfalls? And this is not a, how shall I say, hardcore science. Really, this is kind of more of an art, if you will. All statisticians and economists would admit this. And yet, by doing this, we believe we are increasing the capacity of the immigration program to meet labor market needs. In addition to that previous slide where I mentioned how the human capital works. And again, in this approach, if you probably cannot, but there are engineers and a lot of the trades groups are listed in the current domain right now, in the current program. So another very recent program, you might have heard about this as well. This is the Federal Skilled Trades Program. This is very recent. It was introduced, and again, in response to, this is the second phase of the coin, in response to reported or observed skill shortages. So in areas ranging from sheet metal workers, baler makers, iron workers, welders, crane and heavy equipment operators. There's a whole area of trades spectrum around which for the last 2-3 years we have been identifying shortfalls and skill and labor shortages. Now, another very quick footnote here, and I don't want to be misunderstood as if I'm offering immigration or we think that the immigration is a solution to all these big problems, because we know that immigration is only part of it, and when I say part of it, and Government of Canada has been saying this for a long time, there are skill development programs at the provincial and federal level. There are employers' responsibilities in terms of investing in their own employees' skills upgrades. There are a number of other, there are universities and colleges who also would be responding to labor needs forecasts. So there are a number of actors who are and who should be responding to these challenges, and immigration is only just one of them, trying to find its own niche, if you will, in this policy approach. So, very last slide, and we can come back to these if you like later on. No issues there. The very last slide, a few words on the kind of a future of the, not necessarily the future of all these programs. I think the programs as they are pretty much set in terms of their focus, and we are constantly and on an ongoing basis measuring their performance. You might have heard there is the new design of a system called Expression of Interest, EOI. Basically, this is not a new program. It's a excuse me, it's a kind of a matchmaking program, initiative, where CIC, based on a model that was developed in Australia and New Zealand, is going to create a pool. And into the pool, basically, potential applicants or newcomers overseas or in Canada wanting to come to Canada as permanent residents, they will submit a expression of interest and provide a profile against the type of criteria or information that CIC, not criteria, but information that CIC requests. And these interests will be collected in that pool, and this is an electronic environment. And then this pool, the idea is that in the pool, CIC, using its evidence base again, will rank these individuals in terms of their potential success based on factors that will be publicly, obviously, announced. And then from that pool, in the first instance, and you might say the pool, basically the whole system at this moment, it might change, but the commitment to have it operational in January 2015. And from the pool, at the beginning, CIC will pick its federal skilled workers. By pick, I mean the individuals that CIC will identify will be notified to put in their applications. The first submission is not an application, it's just an interest. And by the time CIC says you can apply, maybe they change their mind, that's a different issue. But as CIC picks them, they will apply and then they will be processed. Not only CIC, of course, but the idea is to also have employers to go into the pool and look at, again, the individuals, their profiles, and identify the individuals that will be potentially best fit, if you will, for the type of labor and skill shortage that they are experiencing. And then they will be able to tap the individual, and if that link is made, it is almost as good as an arranged employment. I didn't speak about that very much, but there is that little stream business line, if you will, that exists today in Canada, where basically an employer, you don't need the EOI to do this. If an employer can demonstrate that they can find the labor that they are looking for, they can initiate an arranged employment process. It's not the TFW process, it's an arranged employment process for an immigrant to come here as a PR and become a permanent resident. So this one is very similar to that, but where several different employers will be able to look at the pool and see if there is a match between their needs and what the individuals are offering. And then from there on, again, the same program. In a certain time period, I really don't know. If I knew, I would share with you. Obviously, the provinces will be able, if there is an agreement, if there is an interest, there are all kinds of conversations happening, will be able to go to the same pool and pick individuals who might perhaps join their PMPs. So it's basically a system that offers that facilitation, if you will, nothing more than that. Otherwise, the policy principles remain the same. In terms of the EOI, I guess you are going to hear more and more in the papers or other CIC website and different publications. It is something to watch and kind of a follow. I would strongly recommend. It is not although it's not a new program, it's a kind of a symbol of how, again, Government of Canada is trying to push the envelope towards economic immigration becoming a more effective policy tool, if you will, to meet Canada's economic growth needs. As you know, growth agenda, and that's where the CIC's, if you will, efforts have been put. At the end, just as a kind of, I guess, concluding remarks, what is the takeaway? There are probably many takeaways, or maybe none, but one thing to keep in mind, I guess, in a sense, the human capital and the occupation skill specific, that tension and that challenge, to keep an eye on that. Another one to keep an eye is that how the TR and PR dynamic plays with each other. This morning there was a question, if a good, effective EOI system, if it works and if it can respond to labor skill shortages experienced by employers effectively, can that also lower the pressure on temporary resident demand? Theoretically, it looks like yes, it could, but only time will tell. Again, something else to watch. And then the very last one, I guess, takeaway again, in terms of when you look at that, remember that slide that you couldn't read with those strategic outcomes and whatnot, CIC, or the way, not only just CIC, but I mean, Canada approaches migration is pretty complex. It is not only just finding the right workers for the right employer, get them working and whatnot. There is the integration, there is a settlement, there is the citizenship, there is the multiculturalism. This morning we talked about in terms of diversity and discrimination issues and welcoming communities. So there's a number of factors that come together to create a suite of policies, if you will. I kind of, today only, because that's the hot topic, that's why I came to you today with the immigration program agenda. Otherwise, that's not necessarily the most exciting one perhaps, but it is important. There are many other aspects of what CIC does. especially in the domain of settlement, in the domain of long-term integration, second generations. The PISA study came out a few days ago. I don't know if you noticed the OECD 15-year-old science, reading, math skills. Second generation stories are very important. I mean, Canadians, immigrants are doing really well at the same level as as Canadian born. So there are a lot of other areas to pay attention to, but this is the one that I kind of shared with you today. So I'll stop at this kind of very moment almost, and hopefully you have some questions. If I made so much sense that you have no questions, I would worry about it.